Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here, in particular to give the Dyason Lecture. I didn't know much about Diana Dyason before this invitation, but I did some reading yesterday, and she was a very impressive woman. So I'm glad to be speaking at an event that has her name. The word sentience has a kind of mixed or uncertain meaning right now, but it refers basically to felt or conscious experience, but often with a particular connotation of pleasure and pain, good and bad, the evaluative or affective side of experience. Now, sometimes the word is used more broadly for any kind of felt experience or any kind of consciousness in the broad sense of that term that's now become current, where to be conscious is just for there to be something it feels like to be you. The word sentience is sometimes used for that, but this talk will be on the side of those questions that does have to do with the pleasure and pain side, the evaluative side, pain especially, pain in various kinds of animals. The talk will be connected to the treatment of these topics in the books Other Minds and Metazoa, but I'm going to go beyond them because some things have changed in just the last couple of years in this area, in particular in work on octopuses and work on insects. So that'll be in some ways the heart of the talk, talking about some of these newer developments. And then at the end I'll show some octopus videos, which have some connection to these themes of pain and pleasure, but also to some extent as a kind of dessert after the scientific stuff that's come before. Now, I can't show these videos over the internet, so they will be for the in-person IRL people here today only. I used the word dessert, which brings to mind food. One of the areas that's going to be affected, I think, by what we're learning about animal experience, one of the areas that will be affected is our policies concerning food, farming, and also experimentation on animals. Should we change, and if so, how much? Now, I'm not going to say a lot about this, but it is going to press on us at various points, and I'll have a little bit at the end, and I hope we might continue with that theme perhaps in the question period at the end. Okay, I think we are in the middle or the early part of the middle of quite a big change in our view of the animal world and more generally our view of how sentience, in the sense that I was talking about earlier, felt experience, especially of an evaluative kind, fits into the world. You might call this a revolution, though that's a word that people use a bit too much. Certainly I think there are big things afoot. Now, I can't resolve any of the big questions in a short talk like this, but I want to chip away and keep chipping away and make some progress about where felt experience is in the world and its history and evolution, how it came to be, which organisms had it in the past, which ones might have it now, and so on. Now, the talk will be mostly about animals, but looking at connections to some other cases as well. First, though, I want to sort of set the stage a bit by making some general comments about life as a whole. One of the changes that's happened slowly, but I think in a fairly definite way, is a recognition of the ubiquitous presence of what is sometimes now referred to as minimal cognition all throughout life, or at least all throughout cellular life. Minimal cognition, that phrase refers to basic kinds of sensing and responding to things, and not merely responding in the way that something might fall over when pushed, but responding in adaptive ways, transducing information and making use of that information. Also not in the simplest possible kinds of ways, but in ways that have a little bit of sophistication. It's surprising to me that even bacteria have this capacity. They can sense what's going on around them, and their responses to it often, or at least in some cases, make use of multiple channels of information coming in, and they can compare what's happening to them now with what was happening to them a few moments ago, and make a response that's suited to the temporal sequence of events rather than just what you're presently encountering. This slide is from a collection from the Royal Society on these issues that was organised mostly by Pamela Lyon, which is, I think, it's quite an important marker in the development of this new view of life in general. Now, here we're talking about all cellular life. We are special, though. We are animals. Organisms like us, animals, are huge colonies of cells. When cells come together in that form, some of the kind of minimal cognitive capacities that cells have just in virtue of being alive is subsumed into the joint activities of a larger system. And some of it is retained and transformed. It's in fact part of how it is that cells can collaborate to make an animal body work as a whole. Okay, that's all background. I want us just to be sort of thinking about the ubiquitous presence of basic kinds of sensing and adaptive responding in life before we start talking about animals. And with this picture of life in mind, we can now start looking at the overall tree of life, the genealogical structure that connects all living things, as far as we know, on Earth, past and present. Okay, I hope you can see the slides well enough from there. It's a tree structure, roughly, with some complications to it, where time is going up the screen. And at the top of the screen, you have a lot of organisms alive today. A tree, a paramecium, sponge, coral, crab, insects, earthworm, a sea slug, octopus, a primate, a marmoset, some birds, there's an extinct dinosaur down there, a deep sea fish, and a starfish. And the shallowness or depth of the branchings that connect these present-day animals indicates how far you have to go back in time to reach a common ancestor of these animals. So this is all of life, or rather, it's a sample of all of life. Animals are one branch. They're the right-hand side branch of that larger structure. Animals are not just a kind of thing linked by a way of living, but a genealogically connected part of the overall tree of life. Now, having said that, it is true that on this branch of the tree, linked by common ancestry, you do have a particular way of living, where action, motion by means of nervous systems and muscle, is a kind of a unifying feature in the animal kingdom. It's not completely a unifying feature because there are sponges and a few other oddities. Well, sponges aren't oddities. Sponges plus some oddities which don't have nervous systems or muscles. But in general, within this part of the tree of life, our part of it, you have an animal way of being found on a particular branch of the tree where controlled motion is distinctive to animals. More exactly, controlled motion and action on a multicellular scale, on the enormous scale that our bodies exist on. Single-celled organisms can do these things. They can move, they can sense, they can, in some cases, remember. And what happened in the early evolution of animals was that there had to be a kind of rediscovery or reinvention of the ability to move in a coordinated way, to sense what's going on and do something coherent in response to it on the new scale of animal life. Okay, let's now start to talk about the history of animal life. We're recognising the diversity of animals alive today. We've got a sort of schematic picture of their relationships where the deeper the branching point, the further you have to go back to find a common ancestor. What do we know about the first animals and how they lived? Well, this is not one of the first animals, but it's one of my favourite photos from this part of science. That's a photo of Reg Sprigg, who is the Australian man who in South Australia some decades ago discovered what were the first fossils of animal life that existed before the Cambrian explosion about 540 million years ago. And what Reg Sprigg is doing there is he is tending to his okay, this very phrase conjures up the response, don't try this at home, his homemade deep-sea diving bell, with which he explored the cold depths of the water off the coast of South Australia. Sprigg was inspecting some old mines back in the 50s and discovered some fossils that were puzzling, which are now recognised as as fossils of the first kinds of animal life that have fossilised. And these, again, were the first fossils found of animals existing before the Cambrian explosion about 540 million years ago. So what was life like? What was it like back then, before the Cambrian, in this earliest stage, now referred to as the Idiacaran, after the hills where Sprigg discovered the fossils? What was life back then? What was life like back then? Well, here is a somewhat famous now painted reconstruction by the English artist John Sibbick. I'm very grateful to John for letting me use these slides when I talk about this. And although it was done some years ago, it captures very much what we think life was like for animals back then. If you look at the slide, so this might have been from around 560, 575 million years ago, the first thing you might think is, well, there's certainly some living things there, but it's not clear what might be an animal. And that's still the case. It is not clear which of these things were animals and which were alive but on some other different branch of the tree. The thing that looks a bit like a bath mat in the middle there is an animal. It was recently confirmed to be an animal by discovering some not so much fossilised but mummified versions of it in Russia, and which still contain cholesterol, which is an animal product. So that organism, Dickinsonia, has been confirmed to be an animal. And if that's an animal, then one of the things we might immediately think is, well, it's not doing very much of the sorts of things that we think of animals typically now as doing. And that is our picture of the Idiacaran. You have a situation where there's very little signs of mobility among living things and animals at this stage. Very little sign of interaction between one another. There's almost no indication of predation, and there's none of the kind of bodily machinery of interaction, mobility, and sensing that we associate with the regime of animal life that's familiar to us now. However, during this time, way back, before 540 million years ago or so ago, a lot of those big, deep branchings in the evolutionary history were occurring. So you have a separation of evolutionary lines at this very early stage. Here's an updated picture of not a single snapshot from the Idiacaran, but three different phases that are now recognised. These more scientific diagrams in my talk were all done by Rebecca Galerntner, by the way, who did the illustrations for the book Metazoa. She has a real knack for being scrupulously accurate but still making diagrams, I think, beautiful. So you have this quiet period in the beginning, and then things change. This is another reconstruction by John Sibbick of the early part of the Cambrian, where suddenly it looks a lot like what we think about as the familiar regime of animal life. Motion, predation. A lot of the animals in the Cambrian, this is from about 540 million years ago onwards, have good eyes and other senses. They have the machinery of interaction and mobility. And the picture that seems likely is that one particular group, the arthropods, the group that today includes insects and spiders and crustaceans, they kind of led the way in this transition, this explosive transition in animal ways of living. So that enormous sort of, actually I don't know how to describe it, sort of alien hovercraft creature there is thought to be a relative of arthropods, and it was one of the dominant predators of the time. They got things going, it looks like, in part by chasing down and probably eating other kinds of life. That meant that other kinds of life had to start evolving means of dealing with this new regime that included action, predation, interaction going on. And you have a situation where various different kinds of animals responded evolutionarily to this new situation by becoming more complicated, becoming mobile, becoming able to interact, defend themselves, and so on. And, okay, this is in some ways quite an important slide because it captures a couple of things. The orange band at the bottom there is the Idiacaran, this early quiet period populated by bath mat-like creatures. And many of the deep branchings are occurring then. So then when the Cambrian comes and life becomes more perilous and active, you already have distinct evolutionary lines in place, independent evolution going on those lines. And in particular, you have three groups, the ones I've marked there in red, where nervous systems become particularly big, action becomes particularly complicated, mobility, manipulation, sensing of objects at a distance, and so on. The three groups that sort of took that way of living far are our group, vertebrates on the far right there, first fish and then animals like us, various arthropods, the sort of beginners of the trend, and we'll talk about arthropods, especially insects and crustaceans, more soon, and this small peculiar group of mollusks over on the left, who are a kind of unexpected outcropping of this sort of highly active, nervously complex way of living. And that's the group that includes octopuses, cuttlefish, and squid. Okay, so that's the sort of picture, that's the sort of historical picture in which the evolution of nervous systems occurred, the evolution of complex forms of sensing, of action, and so on. And now let's start asking questions overtly about the origins of subjective experience and sentience. Well, nervous systems evolved to guide action, to enable us to respond to events. And part of that whole project involves evaluation, working out which events, which opportunities, which stimuli are good and which are bad, which kinds of things happening to you are welcome and which ones are unwelcome. So part of that evolutionary process involved the development of the affective side of cognition, the side that involves assessment, evaluation, this is good, this is bad, and with it, the affective side of experience. Now, there's a way of telling the story of the evolution of subjective experience where this is really central, where it's the kind of responding to danger, detecting damage, making the good and bad distinctions there that becomes really the sort of heart of the story. There's a grad student at Sydney, Walter Veit, who's writing a dissertation in which that is the kind of centre of the whole story about the evolution of subjective experience. Myself, I don't sort of tell the story, or I suspect the story is not best told in that relatively uniform way. I think that the business of being an animal, especially being one of these animals in the sort of red parts of the tree there, involves an experiential side to sensing, experiential aspect of remembering and imagining, also the experiential side of dealing with good and bad, pleasure and pain, welcome and unwelcome events. So I think it's at least part of the story. And now let's start talking specifically about that side of experience and about pain in particular. Biologists distinguish between what's called nociception and felt pain. The idea here is that the registration of bodily damage, of unwelcome events happening in or at your body, is extremely common. Sometimes biologists summarise the situation by saying all animals have some form of nociception. Lynn Snedden, in the paper that I have on the slide there, pretty much says that. And a guiding sort of picture in research in this area is the question, assuming that nociception makes a certain amount of sense for any animal that has to act, stay alive and function, under what circumstances might we expect nociception to also be accompanied by the feelings that we associate with pain, felt pain? as opposed to it being something like a reflex, something like a mere kind of automatic registration of an event and an adaptive response to it. So a lot of research in this area is guided by the question, how might we make a distinction between nociception that is not felt and forms of registration in nervous systems of damage that are felt? Now, one of the first group of animals in which this question was explored in, I think, a way that's become helpful for further discussions is the case of fish. Victoria Braithwaite, a biologist who was a real pioneer here, died recently and unfortunately quite young. She is one of the first people to sort of press on the distinction between nociception and pain in a way that was quite imaginative about how we might sort of find out whether an animal that can't report its experiences, that in the case of fish can't really do much behaviourally to indicate what's going on with it, how we might make a distinction between the mere tracking of damage and something like the sensation of damage. So Braithwaite wrote a book called The Fish Feel Pain and did various experiments which involved things like sort of injection of acetic acid into the lips of trout to see how they would respond, and noting a number of behaviours, which I'll talk about in a moment, that do seem to indicate something more than mere nociception is going on. Now, in the response to Braithwaite's work and other work of this kind, some people, especially in neuroscience, said it's not possible for animals like fish to feel pain pretty much no matter what they do, because pain requires a certain kind of brain architecture. There's a guy called Brian Key in Queensland who wrote a much discussed paper making this case. In order to have pain in us, you have to have certain kinds of things in your brain, a cortex, a kind of bouncing around of information, perhaps between the thalamus in the middle of the brain and the cortex at the top. And if you know that fish don't have that, you know they don't have the wherewithal to feel pain. Key and others published articles like this, and the response to it from many people, including from me, was to say that, look, we know that there are different evolutionary lines that were established early and different kinds of architectures in the nervous systems of animals. And we know that in some cases, they do a very similar job with quite different machinery. So take, for example, vision. In the case of animals like us, vision requires the visual cortex. There's a particular part of our brain that's for seeing. Most animals don't have that, but a great many of them can clearly see. Octopuses can see, bees can see. Different architectures can be present that make possible the activity of seeing. Why shouldn't the same thing be true of the subjective experience of pain? Arguments from the absence of an architectural feature, an architecture resembling ours in animal brains, arguments from that against the possibility of them feeling pain are weak arguments. Okay, but this does make the situation quite difficult. It's hard enough to get a handle on what pain involves in brains like ours, but now we're saying you don't even need a brain like ours to feel something like pain. So how do we make the distinction between mere nociception, the registration of damage without feeling, and something like pain? Well, methods pioneered in fish and chickens and other animals relatively close to us have in recent years been extended to animals much further from us, and that will be a large part of what I will be talking about. For example, in the case of chickens and fish, they will, if they have a preference between two foods, a normal preference between two foods. Sorry, this is a chicken experiment, not a fish experiment. In the case of fish, it's a preference between places rather than foods. The preference between two things, and some injury is done to you, and an analgesic drug is put on the normally less preferred side of the choice. The food you would normally not like, the place you would normally not rather be. Both chickens and fish have a tendency to opt for a normally less preferred option, whether it be place or food, in circumstances where analgesic drugs are associated with that less preferred option. Now, I do find it surprising, but it does seem to be true, that pain-killing drugs that work in us, in many cases, have effects like this in animals very far from us. Another behaviour that's been looked at closely is wound tending. If you injure an animal, does it protect the area? Does it act as if that area is special? The thought is that you might just register damage, nociception without feeling, and then go on with your life. If you continue to pay attention to that spot, if you groom it or shield it from things going on, it suggests an ongoing experienced aspect to the situation. So as I said, what's happened is experiments and methods and ways of asking questions that were initially applied more to vertebrate animals have now been extended to animals further from us. And somewhat surprisingly, the animal where this really worked out, I think in quite striking ways first, was hermit crabs. Okay, this is an illustration by Alberto Raga, who's another artist who I commissioned to do illustrations for the book Metazoa. Alberto is a diver as well as an artist, and I think he has a real knack for capturing sort of how an animal holds itself, especially marine animals. Okay, modern crustaceans, animals like hermit crabs, also animals like prawns, are probably the first invertebrates where experimental evidence for subjective experience of a pain-like kind became strong, especially due to the work of Robert Elwood and his collaborators, various people in his lab, where what they especially looked at was the way that hermit crabs would make trade-offs between different kinds of benefits and harms when making choices. In the case of hermit crabs, small electric shocks appear to be undesirable. A hermit crab will give up its shell if it's exposed to a small electric shock, which it associates with that shell. However, an animal is less likely to give up a shell if the shell is of higher quality. It'll put up with more of a shock if the shell seems to be of higher quality. It will also put up with more of a shock if it can smell the possibility of predators in the water around it. So the aversiveness of an electric shock to a hermit crab appears to be something which is not merely a sort of reflex like, I've been shocked, I'm out of here, but something where the aversiveness of the stimulus is weighed against other features of the situation, the possibility of predation, the difficulty in finding another shell of that quality, and so on. Elwood also found wound tending, not so much in hermit crabs, but especially in shrimp or prawns, a tendency to react, treat a body part differently that had been adversely affected. The evidence for pain-like experience in these sorts of animals, crustaceans, hermit crabs, lobsters, shrimp, etc., was recently reviewed in an LSE report that was used as input to a UK government inquiring into the possibility of changing their animal welfare laws, and it was concluded in the report that the evidence for pain-like experience in lobsters, crabs, and I'll talk about octopuses in a moment, was good. This was done by Jonathan Birch and his collaborators. They were a bit cautious about those trade-offs that I emphasised, but they were very confident about other evidence for forms of pain in crustaceans, including especially that wound-tending set of behaviours. So what's happening here is that the distinction between nociception and the richer thing, nociception plus felt pain-like experience, is being done by looking for the integration of the handling of the aversiveness of an experience with other aspects of decision-making. It's not a simple causal path. It's not just a reflex. The aversiveness of something happening, the badness of something happening, is being factored and weighed in with other things going on in your present circumstance and giving rise to call it a considered decision would be saying too much, but to say it's an evaluatively integrated decision, I think would be reasonable. Let's now talk about octopuses. There's Alberto's octopus. Octopuses are very complicated neurally among invertebrates, also very weird. They have a decentralised or partly decentralised nervous system. They can pull themselves together, though, when they need to. The main researcher on octopus pain is a woman in California, Robin Crook, who's pursued the topic for quite some time. Now, at the time that I wrote the books Other Minds and Metazoa, it was all a little bit inconclusive. There was evidence of various kinds. I in particular was struck by, we have video of an octopus who, in octopuses sometimes, for reasons best known to them, although we have our guesses, raise their rear ends high in the air as part of an apparent display. And a leather jacket came in and bit the octopus right on the end of its rear on the left-hand side of those two images. And the octopus behaved in a completely human-like way, a sort of great tangle of arms going everywhere in irritation and shock at this bite by a fish. But that is the kind of thing that could be a reflex. It's the kind of thing that this could be nociception without felt experience. Crook, in her early work, discovered evidence of wound tending in octopuses. And that I always think of as quite good evidence. The idea that there's an ongoing aversiveness to contact in this body part that's been injured. However, it was still a little bit inconclusive, I think. And then just last year, in 2021, Crook published a paper that I think really pushed things forward in quite a big way. What the new paper by Crook does is study the phenomenon from many directions at once, several directions at once, where the idea is that a number of lines of evidence all together integrate and indicate an integrated handling of the aversive character of something happening to the octopus's body. So the aversive event, the bad event, was, again, acetic acid injections, vinegar, essentially, injected into an arm. And Crook was able to show that this is a fairly mild aversive event for an octopus. It's not that big a deal, but it shows up in a number of different ways that all point in a similar direction. Firstly, you have what's called conditioned place preference. You avoid a place where something aversive has happened to you. The octopuses also engage in wound tending. They protect that part of the body. There's a response to analgesic chemicals in this setting. In particular, the way the place preference test is done is, you work out which of two areas an octopus would prefer to be. You make the more attractive side of the tank or the more attractive environment less attractive with this aversive stimulus, and you see if it changes its preferences. Then you give it pain-killing chemicals and see if it cancels or goes back to the way it was before. So an octopus that's been injected with acetic acid but also given painkillers doesn't acquire the aversion to a particular place that it would if it merely had the aversive event. Crook also looked at physiological evidence of what was going on inside the animal, and the whole picture, I think, fits together quite well, and this is, I think, now the best paper that I know of describing evidence for pain in an invertebrate animal. We had the behavioural side. Alone, that's not a lot. Conditioned place preference, avoiding a place where something bad's happened to you. That's seen even in flatworms, which have tiny nervous systems. So if someone says octopuses feel pain because they show conditioned pain preference, you haven't yet overcome this argument that it might be too simple a causal pathway to involve anything like sensation. But when you add to that the role of analgesics, you add to that wound tending, you add to it the physiology, I think the picture does take a different shape. There's a behavioural first impression and a vague sense of the role that pain might have in an octopus life, then the possibility of an objection to that picture, and then when we look inside, when we look at the animal in more detail, we don't see evidence supporting the objection, we see evidence supporting the first impression. Last case I'll talk about in a bit of detail is insects. Insects are a huge group of animals. Most animal species today are insects. They're everywhere, of course. They evolved from crustaceans, especially in a context of dealing with terrestrial life. Some of them have very big nervous systems, much bigger in the case of bees in particular than crustaceans have, even though the animals are smaller. Very complex with respect to some of their behaviours. Lars Chitka's book is just out, The Mind of a Bee, which is an excellent account of all the surprising complexities in bee behaviours. But for a long time, there was some interesting evidence that no insect feels pain, at least acute pain of a sort associated with something like body damage. The paper that had a lot of influence here was by a guy called Eisenman. This is a University of Queensland group, where the sort of simple observation that Eisenman made is that no one had ever reported a situation where an insect had had its body damaged and reacted as if that was a big deal and a bad thing. The general tendency is that insects just get on with what they were doing, no matter how badly their bodies had been damaged. The idea of a kind of looking after a damaged part, protecting it from further interference, just seemed to be absent from insect life in a way that it was not in the case of crustacean life. And this was very puzzling. Perhaps in part because of this surprise, another University of Queensland group recently published a paper looking explicitly for other kinds of evidence for pain in honeybees, perhaps the most behaviourally complex of insects, applying again that methodology where you see if the animal seeks out analgesic chemicals, seeks out chemicals that might alleviate a painful stimulus, and changes its normal preferences in order to get an analgesic chemical. And found a negative result in that case. They found no evidence. So when I wrote the book Metazoa, I thought, wow, this is surprising. The old Eisenman paper looks like it is standing up. Insects might be very strange. You might have a situation where crustaceans that do have the capacity for pain emerge onto land, start living this sort of rather frenetic, highly organised, mostly very short insect life, and just have no use for the kind of response to events that pain experience involves. Andy Barron, who's a bee researcher at Macquarie, put this possibility to me by saying, yeah, right, for most insects, the adult stage is a kind of disposable reproductive machine in a way that's not true of their analogues and their relatives in the sea, the marine crustaceans. So that was how things looked. And then things changed just a few months ago, where people did the experiment you would have really liked people to do, which is to look at motivational trade-offs in the case of bees, bumblebees in this case, where the question is, can you get a bee to reverse its normal preferences or make a trade-off between various kinds of goods and bads in a situation where one of the bads here is a putatively unpleasant experience. And in this experiment, they used heat rather than sort of mechanical damage to the body as the stimulus. And for some time, I'm told that looked like it was the more promising thing to use with insects. Insects do not like heat in a way that they regard having their legs sort of broken off, roughly speaking, as no big deal. Heat seems to be a more salient event to them. So in this experiment done by Martha Gibbons and her collaborators, bumblebees were given a choice between areas that were too hot but had lots of sucrose, lots of food, and areas that were a comfortable temperature but had less, and found that bees made a very fine-grained distinction such that they would put up with the heat in some areas if the other feeding possibilities were sufficiently worse, if they really were much worse in terms of nutritional food availability. But once you began to increase the value of the unheated areas in the environment, the bees are like, okay, fine, I'm not going to put up with the heat anymore. This is good enough. So it's that kind of trading off, integrated trading off of goods and bads, benefits and harms in an integrated way that we saw in the hermit crabs in particular, and that has inspired a lot of work in this area. Okay, the picture I've actually got to keep a bit of an eye on the time. The picture so far is, for some invertebrate animals, we do have a kind of integration of the registration of damage, the registration of physical harms, an integration of that with other aspects of the decision-making features of a situation, and trade-offs, special behaviours such as wound tending, the seeking out of analgesic chemicals, and so on. The octopus work by Crook, I think, is the most convincing demonstration of pain-like experience in an invertebrate animal. But now that in the case of insects, the problem has in some ways been sort of cracked experimentally, as seen in the Gibbons and collaborators experiment. I think that probably we'll see a lot more on that side as well. Okay, I'm going to skip a section because I'm running a little bit out of time and talk a little bit about plants. Actually, I'll go back one slide to set the plants up. Something I think we have to get used to in this area is that in asking questions about the presence of pain-like experience, it's not going to be a yes or no, an on or off thing in evolution. There's going to be a gradual process by which an animal becomes more apt to have something like pain-like experience as part of its life. Its inner process has become experientialized, in a sense, as the evolutionary process goes on. We expect gradual evolution, and we expect also, although this doesn't follow necessarily, a kind of graded presence of experiences of this kind through the organisms alive today. So if you look along the top of the slide there, we have earthworms, insects, sea slugs, and so on. I don't think there's going to be a sharp line between the ones that definitely have pain or experience of that kind and the ones that don't. I think our language is going to have to start to accommodate something more like the graded presence of this feature. Now, once you accept that for animals, it's natural to ask, what about plants? Does that mean that plants are also going to be on the gradient? Are they going to have a little bit of this feature? Or are plants just a different kind of thing? Do they live in a different kind of way, such that pain-like phenomena are not there for them? Now, that's what I suspect. I think that a likely picture will be one in which there's a sort of gradualist and graded presence view for animals, but an absence of anything, an absence of even a sort of tiny degree of this pain-like quality in the case of plants. Having said this, I have to admit I'm not sure. And every now and then, work done on plants becomes surprising. Now, something that we should think about plants in making this comparison between plants and animals is that a plant like a tree is in some ways quite a different kind of thing from an animal like us. And a plant is a less integrated object. There are some respects in which, as was recognised from even the time of Goethe, a plant is a kind of collective or colonial object rather than a single unified object. And the story I'm telling about the distinction between nociception and felt pain is one, in the case of animals, is one that does rely on this idea of integration and unity in the way an animal confronts the world, an animal deals with its circumstances. And plants are just not integrated in that way. Having said that, as I say, there are surprises. There was an experiment done about 4 years ago now on a weed-like plant showing that damage to a small part, one leaf on the left-hand side of the slide there, leads to a kind of cascade of signalling molecules being sent through other parts of the plant, leading to defences being prepared at quite distant physical parts of the same plant, where there's a fairly, a decent kind of analogy between the kinds of chemical processes that are involved in this plant-based signalling and what would happen in animals. It's not too dissimilar a process. So when I talk about plants, I always wonder if there are more surprises to come. But the sort of bet I would make is that we should think that in the case of animals, there's some definite yeses among invertebrates as well as vertebrates, crustaceans, octopuses, and perhaps a bunch of others. There are cases which will be sort of marginal, borderline, or cases where the idea of graded presence is important. And I think that gastropods such as slugs and snails are going to be a sort of good case to look at for that kind of situation. And some no's as well. I think that's likely to how it's going to be, but I think plants are going to wind up on the no side, even as we learn more. Okay, I want to make one more point, and then I want to show a couple of videos to end. What I've been doing when telling the story about the good work, the work on crustaceans, the bees and the octopuses, is looking for integration of the handling of aversiveness of an experience, of a stimulus with other aspects of decision making. The kind of, again using a somewhat anthropomorphic language, a kind of considered handling of the aversiveness of an experience. The fact it's not merely a simple causal path like a reflex. Have we learned that this is pain? Well, as opposed to something similar to pain that's not actually pain. This is a vexed question that gets scientific as well as philosophical discussions, I think, into difficulty. If you ask the question, does a crustacean or an octopus have pain like in us, then the answer must surely be no. It must make a difference to have the kind of high-powered nervous system we have, being a warm-blooded animal with an enormous brain. Okay, is it something other than pain but like it? What's the borderline between other kinds of pain and something that's not pain but similar to it? Well, once you ask the question that way, it's not just empirical uncertainty, factual uncertainty that presses itself forward, but there's probably a kind of just, a sort of weakness in our concept such that that question can't really be answered. And I think one reasonable response there is to make a move that has some things in common with a suggestion made in this area by Marion Dawkins in some well-known discussion of policy questions around animal welfare. So Dawkins, this is Marion, not Richard Dawkins, who spent many decades writing about animal welfare questions around zoos and farming, says, stop trying to work out whether these animals have experience, conscious experience, whether they are conscious of what's good and bad happening to them. Ask questions that can be answered. Ask, is the animal healthy? And ask whether the animal's preferences are being satisfied. Ask about those and conduct welfare policy discussions in those terms rather than trying to embroil yourself in unanswerable philosophical questions. Well, I think there's a right move or an insight here and also a wrong move. The right move that Dawkins makes is to say we might end up in a situation here where our concepts, like the concept of conscious experience and the concept of pain, where our concepts are unhelpfully messed up, have the wrong contours for handling the problem, and are not a good basis for policy. And we should then try to guide our choices with different concepts. The mistake I think that Dawkins made was to pick alternative concepts that are too broad, being healthy or unhealthy, and having preferences either satisfied or not. Those distinctions are applicable to plants. They're applicable to all sorts of animals whose nervous systems are probably too simple to admit of any kind of experience. It's a kind of, I think, a mixing up of questions about the presence of a kind of a sort of self-concern, which is present in plants, all living things. It's an aspect of what I called earlier minimal cognition. It's a mixing up of that with things that are akin at least to experience, and it's not taking the sort of moral status of experience itself sufficiently seriously. So if we look to what I've been talking about in my discussion of the experiments, integrated handling of aversive events and how they fit into decision making, and regard that as a test for when something other than mere nociception is present, this is more demanding than asking questions about health versus ill health, but it's more scientifically tractable, perhaps, than asking questions of the form, is this another sort of pain, or is it something other than pain that's, in some ways analogous to it? So I would like to see a kind of moderate revision of the concepts with which we carry out policy questions in this area, but not as big a revision as the one we see in Dawkins's work. Okay, I have a little bit of a time issue, and I do want to sort of get to this very last thing that I want to do. I thought at the end of this talk, and I'll just ask the video people to avert the eyes of the camera here. These are videos I can show IRL to humans, but I shouldn't show on the internet. These are some videos of octopus behavior taken at a site down at Jervis Bay, Octopuses, which I've been studying for a year or so now. And these events were important in my realising the complexity of the behaviour of some animals far from us. So here we have a bunch of octopuses, normally quite solitary animals, but in this case having to deal with each other. There's an octopus doing that display with the rear over the head that I mentioned earlier. We have a pufferfish coming in to inspect closely. The pufferfish always reminds me, in its sort of demeanour there, of a particular BBC naturalist. The octopuses at this site also fight quite a lot. There's quite a bit of conflict. They have to deal with each other in a way that octopuses don't normally. And octopus life, when it's solitary, might seem to be fairly quiet, but when you put a bunch of octopuses together, as happens in this natural environment down the south coast, you see a great deal of complexity that pufferfish continues to observe. The next video I want to show, what we do at this site sometimes is put down GoPro cameras and go away. So we see what octopuses get up to when there's lots of octopuses and nobody looking. I love these videos in part because we have to sort of fiddle with the colour a lot. The GoPros are terrible with underwater colour. And what we wind up with is what looks to me like a kind of television broadcast from a distant alien planet coming in, beamed into human TV receivers. So here's a bunch of octopuses doing what they do when no human is around watching them. Or at least when no living humans are around watching them. They take quite a strong interest in our cameras on some occasions. So there we have an octopus who is inspecting one of our stationary cameras and adjusting its angle to get a more attractive view. Having adjusted the camera, the octopus returns to its spot. Okay, I'm trying to remember what comes up next in this particular video. Oh yeah, there's a behaviour we've become very interested in, which we haven't yet written about at all. But one thing you'll see as this bit of video goes on is lots of these events where octopuses sort of raise an arm as another octopus passes. Here's another octopus coming in to inspect one of our cameras. And as it moves around and as other octopuses move in the background, you'll see those arm raises and touches. So here's a still image of them. We're very curious what this involves. It says something about perhaps my personality, that when I first saw this on video, I thought of it as a bit sort of pugnacious, a bit like boxing. But a lot of the time it's not. It's a bit more like a high five. And in this particular video stretch, I think we're seeing very much the high five. This is a behaviour I'd very much like to untangle. Is it a situation where individual recognition is involved? Is it a situation where it's just a kind of, here I am, mark my presence or something like that? It's really a puzzle and something that Well, nobody's written, that was a slightly more pugnacious one. No one's written about it because it's hardly ever been observed, at least outside of this site. What comes up next in this one? I think there's a particularly... okay, more of the same high fives. You tell me if that looks sort of pugnacious or not. I sort of have gestalt switches sometimes when I watch it myself.
Peter, they ride on top of mine after this.
Yes, and you're about to see the consequences of that. So someone is underneath there, and okay, he spends longer underneath than I remember. It is a kind of wrestle that's going on, and one that ends with a kind of jet-propelled escape like that. So octopuses do sometimes kill each other with a kind of strangulation. We've never seen it, however, at this site. We've never seen an octopus in all these conflicts be killed or seriously injured. I gave a talk on this stuff at Oxford, and there was a computer scientist, Miranda Mowbray, who looked at my videos and said, yeah, right, watching octopuses fight, it's like seeing a giant pillow fight between pillows. Okay, this last video unfortunately is not playing, so we tried this earlier, but it's not playing. What it shows is this sort of beautiful flower-like motion in flight that a particular octopus does. And I have that on my thank you slide. But before I do that, I just want to say a particular thanks. All the octopus footage there was taken in Booderee National Park down the south coast, which is now run entirely by the Wreck Bay Aboriginal community. It's one of the national parks that's been handed back, and they're doing a fantastic job in maintaining the park. I'm very grateful to them for their work in maintaining Booderee. So thanks to Wreck Bay. Thanks also to various people who've collaborated with me on the octopus work and in other kinds of work. And I'll stop there so we have some time for questions.